Hello, everyone. My name is Tim Crane. I'm Professor of Philosophy at the Central European University in Vienna, and it's a pleasure to be talking with you today. I'm very grateful for this invitation. And my topic today is the topic of your workshop, which is physicalism. Now, I'm going to share some slides now to begin my talk. What I want to do today is to try and understand not so much whether physicalism is true, but to understand rather what question it is that physicalism is supposed to be answering. So my theme today is that based on the assumption that it's common to see physicalism as a dominant proposed solution to the mind-body problem. But what is that problem exactly? What is the mind-body problem supposed to be? And how should we formulate it these days? I don't assume that every problem has a timeless form in philosophy, as if there's only one way problems can be articulated, or that we're trying to uncover the real essence of a philosophical problem. I think philosophical problems change with time and with knowledge that we have elsewhere. And so over time, problems come and go, and they change their shape. My question is how we should formulate the mind-body problem these days. I want to argue today that there are two very distinct questions, and these questions are not always kept apart in the philosophical discussion today. One is a question about the physical world, another is a question about the brain. And it's the first mind-body problem addresses the question about the relationship between the mind and the physical world. And the second mind-body problem addresses the question about the mind and the brain. And these are, to some extent, separable questions. So the predicament I think we're in at the moment is that we're introduced to the mind-body problem in terms of a choice. It can seem like a choice between two things. Either an idea that no one really believes, which is substance dualism, and an idea that no one really understands, and that's physicalism. And this is not a good position to be in. If this is supposed to be one of our preoccupations in philosophy, one of our central questions, our central problems, if it's formed as a choice between an idea that no one believes and an idea that no one really understands. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that in the first part of my lecture, but here I want to try and sketch a better understanding of the issue. This is my overall aim, is not to answer the mind-body question today, but rather to get a better understanding of what the question is. And therefore, I hope a better understanding of physicalism. So I want to do three things in today's talk. I'll say a little bit about the old debate about mind and body. Then I will say a little bit about the physical, the idea of the physical, and then I will say something about the brain and its relevance to this question. So the traditional debate here, or a traditional debate, was formulated around the question, are mind and body distinct substances or different substances? And traditionally, monism says no, and dualism says yes. Of course, idealism is a form of monism that says that the fundamental substance is mental, and physicalism or materialism is the form of monism that says the fundamental substance is material or physical. And dualism says that there are two kinds of fundamentally different substances. So materialism then is the dominant form of monism, but the question that this all presupposes is, what is substance? And should we be asking in terms of the question in terms of substance at all? Should we be talking about substance at all? Now, in the traditional debate, what was at issue was the Cartesian conception of substance, the conception that comes from René Descartes in Western philosophy. And here's how Descartes defines substance. he defines substance by saying, all we can mean by substance is a thing that exists in such a way that it doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. So those of you who are familiar with the historical discussions of substance will know that the ideas that come from Aristotle, transmitted into medieval philosophy through the Islamic tradition, contained a much richer idea of substance. And the idea of substance that they had involved many more ideas. Descartes, in his Principles of Philosophy, in this definition here, and also he used it in his Meditations on First Philosophy, he stripped down the notion of substance to this simple definition, a thing that exists in such a way that doesn't depend on anything else for its existence. Now, it's really not obvious that this should be a starting point for a philosophy of substance or for a philosophy of the mind or for a metaphysics at all. There are many things one can say about this notion of substance, but interestingly enough, when philosophers talk about the mind-body problem in terms of the question of whether there are two substances, they often don't dwell on what a substance is, but they use a rather cruder idea. They just ask us, does the world consist of two different kinds of stuff? Distinguished philosophers have used this kind of contrast between different kinds of stuff, as if on the one hand, there was material stuff or matter, and that's what material things are made out of. And then there's mental stuff, and that's what mental things are made out of. And here's an example. Frank Jackson, in his celebrated book, From Metaphysics to Ethics, he contrasts being made of matter or being made of physical substance with being made of mental substance, and he uses the word ectoplasm as a word for mental substance. What Jackson says, being made of ectoplasm is not a physical property, where ectoplasm is to be understood as a kind of stuff incompatible with the physicalist's view of what kinds there are, perhaps the stuff out of which thoughts are made, according to Descartes. Now, so those of you who know Descartes, you know that Descartes thought the mind, each of us was an individual substance. Each mind was an individual substance. The material world was just one substance, which was divided into sort of lumps of matter. But lumps of matter were not themselves substances because they couldn't exist independently. Now, Jackson is now contrasting this with something else, which is the idea of stuff out of which thoughts are made. He uses the word ectoplasm. Now, a very brief and not entirely serious digression might look at what this word ectoplasm actually means. I don't know whether you've come across it or whether you've come across it outside the philosophical context. Ectoplasm itself was a term introduced by the French physiologist Charles Richet, who was president of the UK Society for Psychical Research in the 19th century. Psychical research here, of course, meaning research into supernatural psychical phenomena like communication with the dead, or telekinesis, or telepathy, and this is the subject matter of psychical research. Ozone was defined by Charles Richet as followed. It was white, milky, slimy, ectoplasm was defined as follows. White, milky, slimy smelling of ozone. It was solid, but also sometimes appeared as vaporous, emanating from the mouths, ears, and noses of physical mediums, usually in a darkened room and surrounded by fellow spiritualists. Now, these were in these spiritual seances that these psychical researchers used to try and create to bring up the spirits of the dead. Now, my point in raising this is not that this is a serious area of research or that there is such a thing as ectoplasm, but when the word ectoplasm is introduced by Jackson, he's clearly thinking of it as a kind of something which is a quasi-material substance. It's like a sort of matter out of which thoughts are made. And what's wrong with that whole way of thinking is, as Howard Robinson says in a well-known paper, that mental substance is not something composed of ghostly atoms, whatever that would mean, but something that is not made of anything at all. Descartes' point is that the soul has no parts. And if the soul has no parts, then it cannot be made of anything. To be made of something, to be constituted out of something, is to have parts. If you don't have parts, then you can't be made of anything. The self or the soul is a simple substance. Now, I'm not saying that idea is true. I'm just saying that it's a gross misrepresentation to think of the contrast between mental substance and material substance as the contrast between one kind of stuff and another kind of stuff. It's rather this more abstract contrast between things that can exist independently and things that cannot. Things that have dependent existence. Now, I said then that this idea that mental substance is a kind of ghostly stuff is basically a mistaken understanding of the Cartesian understanding of substance, of the Cartesian theory of substance. In material substance, the case is slightly different. I think people understand the notion of material substance as the Cartesians use it. What is material substance? And Descartes' view is that each substance is characterized by its primary attribute. And the primary attribute of mental substance is thought, and the primary attribute of material substance is extension. It's being extended, that is to say, having size and shape, and being extended across physical space. That's the primary attribute of material substance. Matter is essentially extended. Now, the fact is that this is not the conception of matter that we find in physics today. Matter is not characterized as extension. There's a complex, rich mathematical theory of matter, which does not start from the Cartesian assumption. And the idea, for example, there could be such a thing as a point particle, which is not extended. There is also, matter is something that also in the material world, part of the material world, are things that aren't matter at all. Fields and forces and so on. So physics does not operate with the Cartesian notion of matter. So why should we, as philosophers, think that we know better and that we can frame a question as being between the Cartesian notion of mind and the Cartesian notion of matter? What this promoted, I think, in philosophy was a move from materialism to physicalism. Materialism relied, and here I'm defining terms in a way, it's not so important how the terms are actually used, but I'm just distinguishing two ideas. Materialism starts with the idea of matter, or with the definition of matter, and then asks and then asserts that everything is matter, or is made of matter. Physicalism starts rather with the idea of everything being as physics says it is, where physics is, the content of physics is not determined a priori by a definition, but rather empirically through its empirical findings. So that takes us to physicalism. And this leads me then to my second theme, which is physicalism and the physical. Now, here's a good description of what physicalist metaphysics is. Physicalist metaphysics, the ideology of this was defined by David Lewis as metaphysics built to endorse the truth and descriptive completeness of physics, more or less as we know it. That's from his paper, New Work for a Theory of Universals. That's what physicalist metaphysics is in general. Then physicalism as a doctrine is the following idea. it relies on the idea of physical property. Lewis defined these as perfectly natural intrinsic properties which need nothing bigger than a point at which to be instantiated. Hence, they are not extended. Perfectly natural and intrinsic are notions that he's defined elsewhere. I won't go into those details. We can discuss it in the discussion if you like. Physicalism then is the doctrine that everything supervenes on this arrangement of properties. As Jackson and Lewis would like to put it, any physical duplicate of the actual world, of our world, is a duplicate in every respect, or as they call it, a duplicate simpliciter. That's again from Lewis's essay, New Work for a Theory of Universals. So today's mind-body problem then as posed by physicalism is the following. This is the question, does everything necessarily supervene on the physical? The supervenience thesis that Jackson and Lewis and others, many others have put forward, McLaughlin and many others, the supervenience thesis is the claim that the claim I've just expressed, that any physical or minimal physical duplicate of our world, the actual world, is a duplicate in every respect. So this talks about duplicates of worlds. This is just a way of talking. You don't have to believe in possible worlds in order to formulate things in this way. Now, those of you who are familiar with the debate of the last 25 or 30 years will know that the challenge to this is posed by David Chalmers and others in terms of the following thought experiment, whether there could be a zombie, where a zombie is a creature who is a physical replica of you or me, but lacks consciousness. Are zombies possible? Chalmers asked. And if zombies are possible, then physicalism is false. It's pretty easy to see why, because if any duplicate of the whole world is a duplicate in every respect, that is if any physical duplicate, is a duplicate in every respect, then any physical duplicate of a duplicate of a physical part of that world will also be a duplicate in every respect. So a physical duplicate of me could not be a zombie. If zombies are possible, if there is a world which is physically the same as this world, but in which there are zombies, then physicalism is false. So that's the setup. Physicalism says zombies are not possible, and property dualism, as Chalmers put it, says yes. So we've avoided the question of substance. We're just talking about properties, the instantiation of properties, and how those properties depend on other properties, the instantiation of physical properties. But I want to raise the question of whether we really understand the supervenience claim in the first place. If we're looking at physics as it actually is, you have to assume that there is some relationship between quantum reality and macroscopic reality. And this would be the relationship, according to physicalism, of metaphysically necessary determination. The bottom level metaphysically necessitates the upper levels and the levels of macroscopic things, bigger things, the higher level things. These days people might talk about grounding. They might say that the higher level things are grounded in the lower level. And that's one way to go. I don't think the term grounding, notion of grounding, adds anything useful to this debate myself. We can discuss that if you like. So this is why I'm talking in terms of supervenience. In any case, there has to be some relationship between the quantum reality and the macroscopic reality. But this is a huge question in physics and in the philosophy of physics. This is the question posed by the puzzle of Schrödinger's cat. And I'm no specialist in the philosophy of physics, but as far as I know, this question has yet to be satisfactorily answered. So we shouldn't assume that we can answer the question of the relationship that we know, we shouldn't assume that we know how to answer the question, the relationship between quantum reality and macroscopic reality. But if we can't answer this question, then how can we assess the supervenience claim? So that's my skepticism about the formulation of physicalism as a supervenience claim. It's not that it's not true. It's that I don't think we really understand how it can be true. So this is why I say the choice we're offered is sometimes looks like a choice between an idea no one believes, substance dualism, and an idea no one really understands. When I say no one, of course, I'm exaggerating. We can go into details. I'm sure some people believe in substance dualism. I know some people do. And I'm sure that some people believe in, some people understand the relationship between quantum reality and macroscopic reality. And let's hope so in some way. But I would rather put that to one side and look instead at another line of thought inspired by Bertrand Russell, which has come to prominence recently in discussions of physicalism and the mind-body problem. This starts with the idea that the physical world is wholly describable in mathematical or structural terms. Conscious experience, on the other hand, is not wholly describable in mathematical or structural terms. Something is always left out of the nature of conscious experience if you describe it purely mathematically or structurally. But conscious experience, or its qualities, as they're sometimes called, nonetheless exist somewhere. So where do they exist? That's the mind-body problem as nicely formulated in some recent work by Philip Goff. And let me quote this nice passage from Goff's book, The Reality of Consciousness. The success of mathematical physics, says Goff, resulted from limiting the scope of inquiry by putting the sensory qualities that we encounter in conscious experience, colors, smells, tastes, sounds, outside the domain of the physical sciences. We are able to give a purely mathematical description of what's left over. But those qualities that Galileo took out of the material world still exist somewhere and must be accounted for somehow. If the spicy taste of the paprika isn't really in the paprika, then where is it? Galileo thought that it was in the soul. But if we don't want to believe in souls, then we need to find a place in the natural world for the sensory qualities. Now, the reference to Galileo is to Galileo's idea that the physical world is exhaustively described in mathematical terms. As Galileo put it, that God has written the book of the world in squares and circles. Now, there are two things I want to draw attention to here. Goff is talking about the sensory qualities we encounter in conscious experience. And he means things like colors, smells, sounds. Galileo said those could not be in the physical world. And other philosophers then followed him. But these qualities that Galileo took out of the world must still exist somewhere and must be accounted for somehow. So this is Goff's contrast is between the quantitative mathematical description of the universe given by physics and the reality of the qualities which cannot be entirely captured through a mathematical or structural description. Now, in his argument against physicalism, Goff employs the machinery of what Frank Jackson called the knowledge argument. And I'm sure this is familiar to all students of philosophy of mind these days. The knowledge argument involving a thought experiment about a colorblind scientist, Mary, who has never seen anything red but knows everything that there is to know about the physics of color. This knowledge argument and the thought experiment is used by philosophers like Chalmers, Goff, Martina Nieder-Rümelin, and Howard Robinson, and many others to argue for this kind of understanding of the mind-body problem. Jackson's thought experiment involving Mary in the black and white room says that Mary knows all the physical or scientific facts, but does not know all the facts. Therefore, not all facts are physical. That's basically the argument, and there's been a huge discussion of this argument of whether it's sound or valid or whatever. I'm not going to talk any more about this argument here because this is to assess the truth of physicalism, whereas I'm trying to find out what the question is that physicalism is trying to answer. Now, Goff's answer to this is physicalism is trying to say that the world is entirely tractable in mathematical terms. Now, I want to question this, because Goff wants to contrast what he calls the quantitative with the qualitative. The qualitative involves the sensory qualities, the colors, smells, and things of the sensory world. The quantitative is a term for the mathematical machinery of modern physics. But I want to say, do we have to make so many heavyweight metaphysical assumptions in order even to articulate something worth calling the mind-body problem? Does the mind-body problem have to be a problem that you can only formulate if you accept things like Goff's distinction between the qualitative and the quantitative, or relatedly between the intrinsic and the structural or the functional? These are things we can talk about if you're interested in that. But here, let me focus on the qualitative-quantitative distinction. What I want to say is, if there's a mind-body problem, how can it depend on such a controversial metaphysical starting point? So I have two questions for those who want to pose the problem in this way. And the first question is, quantitative is a feature of a theory of something, not a feature of the thing itself. When you say something is quantitative, what you mean is that it involves measurable quantities, and that those quantities are measured by numbers and other mathematical objects like functions, sets, and things like that. Being quantitative is therefore a feature of the theory of something, the quantitative theory of space-time. The measurement of space-time involves quantitative machinery, but that's the measurement involves it, not the space-time itself. It's not that space-time itself is something quantitative, it's just space-time is something that can be measured. Second question, couldn't the knowledge argument challenge arise even if physics were not quantitative? And what seems to me so strange about the approach that people like Goff and Robinson are taking is that it presupposes that physical science has developed in a particular way. What if physical science had not developed in this way? What if physical science was fully Aristotelian? Could you still raise the knowledge argument question? That is, would there be something that Mary, who knew the whole of the physical science, did not know because she hadn't seen color? It seems to me the answer is yes, but that depends on lots of other questions. So this is why I'm not sympathetic to the idea of formulating the mind-body problem, the question to which physicalism is supposed to be an answer, in terms of the contrast between the qualitative and the quantitative. So this takes me to my final section, where I just want to say a few things about the brain. And what I want to say is, I think, unlike this talk about the qualitative and the quantitative, and unlike the talk about substance and supervenience and the dependence of these perfectly natural intrinsic properties, of everything on the perfectly natural intrinsic properties, in the case of the brain, we have certain established facts. And I want to start with those facts. I want to start with what is known, what we really know about the human brain, and how it works. What's known to an impressive degree of accuracy is the basics of cell biology and the neuron cells, in particular the neuron cells in the brain. The anatomy of the brain is well known, that is to say its structure, and the physiology of the brain, that is to say, roughly speaking, its functional purpose, what the parts of the brain are for. Now, there's a huge amount of knowledge here, but nonetheless, I want to say this knowledge gives rise to something which is deeply puzzling. I want to illustrate this with a light-hearted example from a little book about a woman, an American woman, written by an American woman called Julie Powell, who wrote about a famous American chef or a cook called Julia Child. She wanted to make all the recipes that Julia Child had ever wrote about in 1 year. Why she wanted to do that? Maybe to write a book about it. Maybe that was the point of it. But anyway, there's an amusing book, and there's a passage in the book which is very striking. And it's to do with when she's trying to cook brains. Now here's a rather out of focus picture of some brains. I apologize to vegetarians. These brains before they were going to be cooked. And she was looking at these brains, and she writes this about what it is to look at the brain. She said, the real problem is the philosophical tailspin part, the inconsolable mystery of life, consciousness, the soul. But it's just this flabby, pale, small organ that disintegrates in your fingers if you let the faucet run too fast. How can this be? How can we be? It's a beautiful passage, I think, where really someone who's not a philosopher at all, but has this real feeling of the mystery of life, the mystery of life when you look at a brain. And you think, how can that be the source of myself, of consciousness? A really, really nicely expressed puzzle, I think. Now, this is what we know about the brain, or some of it. And now I'm going to say things that are very much common knowledge, and I'm sure that many or most of you know all these things already. So I'm not going to explain much of what I say, just remind you of things. The brain is divided into the sections, the lobes, the cortex, and then there's the lower brain, the brainstem, and then there are these areas inside the brain here. So basically the cortex, the lobes, are the areas where the higher mental faculties are generally located. And in the more phylogenetically ancient parts of the brain, arguably, are where motor functions, thermoregulation, and things like this, and some sensory capacities are located. So I'm sure this is common knowledge. The brain, of course, is made up of neurons, the central cell, the nerve cell, the neuron. And this is an abstract descriptive picture of a neuron. It's rather beautiful. In the human brain, there are, in the cortex, the cerebral cortex, there are between 10 and 20 billion neurons. There are between 55 and 70 billion neurons in the cerebellum, which is the lower part of the brain. There are about 100 billion neurons in the human brain altogether, 100 billion neurons. People say the brain is the most complex thing there is. I don't know how we measure complexity, but it's certainly a very complex object. And all these neurons are connected to one another in the remarkable achievement of evolution or God. There are three kinds of neurons. Basically, there are the sensory neurons, the motor neurons, and the interneurons, which are the things of the other kind. The mechanism of neurotransmission is well understood, that the chemicals, neurotransmitters, are conveyed across the synaptic cleft. The synaptic cleft is the gap between the separate neurons. Neurotransmitters, these bind to certain receptors in the synaptic cleft. So we have an almost mechanical understanding at this tiny level of what is going on there. And they convey these signals called action potentials across the neurons. There's a more complex picture of a neuron, and where you can see the synaptic cleft blown up in this circle in the top. And you can see how the pictures here that the neurotransmitters bind across the cleft to the receptors on the other side. And the signals are sent down the axons to the synapses at the end. So this is all well known, as I say, and pretty much established science. But what has it got to do with consciousness? What's it got to do with intentionality? What's it got to do with the will, belief, desire, emotion, the subject's perspective on the world? How are those things related? Well, the general view is that the lobes, so if you're just taking the lobe structure of the brain, divided into the frontal lobe, which is given the task of executive control of action, decision, and so on. And the parietal lobe involves the processing of sensory input. The occipital lobe involves processing of visual input. And the temporal lobe involves language and hearing. This is grossly oversimplified, and there's a lot of debate about which mental functions are located in which parts of the cortex and the brain and rest of the brain. This isn't my point here. My point is that there is an attempt to understand which parts of the brain are associated with different kinds of mental activity. And that is, I think, it's an ongoing research program which has a lot of evidence for going for it, but also there's a lot of speculation there. So it's very much an open-ended research program. So when we contrast the anatomy, there's the anatomical picture of the brain and the physiology. This then has the areas of the brain identified in terms of their functions. So we have the speech area, and we have the visual cortex, and so on and so on. And then when you combine anatomy and physiology, you get roughly a picture like this. And this is again a very simplified picture. But there you see the different functions associated with different parts of the brain. Does this tell us how mind and brain are related? Well, it tells us that different things are carried out by different parts of the brain, that the brain is associated with mental functioning, and different parts of the brain are associated with different parts of our mental functioning. That much is true. However, the puzzle remains. The puzzle that Julie Powell so nicely expressed in that book remains. Colin McGinn, in a famous paper, said, how is it possible for conscious states to depend upon brain states? How can technicolor phenomenology arise from soggy grey matter? We saw the soggy grey matter in that picture. That's what it is. How can that be the thing that gives rise to all this experience? How could the aggregation of millions, in fact billions, of individually insentient neurons generate subjective awareness? We know that brains are de facto, as a matter of fact, the causal basis of consciousness, but we have, it seems, no understanding, however, of how this can be so. Somehow we feel the water of the physical brain is turned into the wine of consciousness, but we draw a total blank on the nature of this conversion. Neural transmissions just seem like the wrong kind of materials with which to bring consciousness into the world. Now, there's a lot going on in this passage from McGinn. I just want to draw attention to two things. First of all, he talks about technicolor phenomenology arising from soggy grey matter. So he's interested in the question of how our experience, the phenomenology, how an experience seems, can be generated by the kinds of things that we already know are in the brain. And the second point is that these neural transmissions seem like the wrong kind of materials with which to bring consciousness into the world. Well, that raises the question of what the right kind of materials would be. And that's something perhaps we could discuss in discussion, whether this is a good way of thinking of it or not, or whether we've already gone on the wrong track by saying that it seems like the wrong kind of materials. But the general point I want to make is what the question here is about the brain and its role. The question McGinn is raising is about the brain and its role as the basis of consciousness. It's a question about explanation. It's a question about understanding and intelligibility. It's not actually primarily an ontological question, because we're assuming here that the brain is responsible for these mental capacities and their exercises. What we don't know is how to explain that, how to understand it. It just doesn't seem intelligible that that could be the basis of our mentality. That's what the question is about. It's a question about explanation, understanding, and intelligibility. It's not a question about substance. It's not a question about the fundamental nature of reality. So posing this question actually doesn't make any assumptions about physicalism. And this is something we may want to discuss in the discussion. But it seems to me, whatever your view on the question of physicalism, where remember, physicalism is the view that everything supervenes on the fundamental physical properties of the world. Whatever your view about the question of physicalism, you can raise the question about how mental capacities are embodied in the brain. And actually, to come clean about my own convictions here, I think the question of physicalism is largely pointless, and I don't think it's an important question for us, and I don't think that we should address it. I won't stop people addressing it because that's the nature of philosophy. We don't stop people talking about things, but I don't think it's a good question to ask. Whereas the question about how mental capacities are embedded in the brain or embodied in the brain is, I think, a deep and difficult question based on things that we already know. So this is what, and I don't think you need physicalism in order to raise that question about the brain. All you need is a sense of the understanding of how the brain works, and a sense of the gap between that and the capacities that emerge from the brain. So the question, this second mind-body question, is not about the nature of the physical world in general. For all I know, the mental does not supervene on the physical. Perhaps there are areas where supervenience fails, but I still want to know how mental capacities are embedded in the brain. I don't have to make any assumptions about whether there are fundamental particles, or whether there's a bottom level of fundamental particles, or whether everything is infinitely divisible, or anything like that. I don't have to make any assumptions about whether the world can be characterized purely quantitatively by physics. I don't have to assume any of those things. I just have to have this sense of unintelligibility based on the knowledge of how the brain actually works. The puzzling thing is that the more you find out about how the brain works, the more amazing it seems, and the more puzzling it seems that this can be the seat of consciousness. So that brings me to my conclusion then. I have two very different and independent questions here. And physicalism is often said to be the answer to each of these questions. And sometimes people want to call themselves physicalists because they want to identify the mind with the brain. But I just want to distinguish these questions. What is the place of the mind or consciousness in the world as conceived by physics? That's the first question. And the second question is, how is the mind embodied in the brain? And I want to say these are two very, very different questions. And while the first question, I think, is based on a lot of complex and debatable assumptions, the second question is based on what we actually know about the world and the puzzlement that arises from that. So thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to having a discussion with you, I will now stop sharing my screen, and I will go back to this picture, and I will stop my recording. So thank you very much, and thanks for your attention.